The following is a conversation with Dustin Coates, Principal Product Manager, and Claire Helme-Guizon, Machine Learning Engineer at Algolia. Algolia is a search and recommendation services provider which offers symbolic, keyword-based search API that can be integrated with any existing product or application. In 2020, Algolia partnered with OpenAI to connect GPT-3 with its already existing search technology. If you're interested in GPT-3, make sure to subscribe and check out our latest GPT-3 manual book for O'Reilly. This is Sandra and Shubham, and we hope you enjoyed this interview. Thanks so much for finding the time to talk to us about your experience with GPT-3 as an organization. For us, it's a really unique opportunity to learn more about the type of challenges and the type of the unique characteristics of introducing such a technology in a larger scale organization. So thanks so much once again for finding the time. So I wanted to ask you about your Algolia Answer product. Could you give us like a basic overview of what was happening behind the scenes? How did it evolve from an idea into a product that you introduced into your ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. So we started about a year and a half ago. Is that right, Claire? Around February 2020 is when we started. And what we were looking at was, is there an ability and is there a market for us to do essentially what Google is doing with its featured snippets, where you search for something and you get back the response right away. Not just you get back the record, you get back the article, but you get back what's actually answering the question. And so Claire came on around that time, and this was her initial project that she was working on. We explored a number of different technologies, and I'm sure we can get into that topic as well, but we explored a number of different technologies. And we were fortunate enough as well at the same time that OpenAI reached out to us and mentioned, hey, we've got this new technology that you might be interested in checking out. So we did do that. We benchmarked it against these other technologies as well, found that it performed really well in terms of the quality of the search results returned, and decided to move forward with that. We then worked with some existing customers of ours to determine, hey, is this something that would be interesting to you? And further, can the quality stand up to what we expect? We found that indeed it did, and there was indeed an interest in this type of search experience, and further, a search experience where people didn't have to type exactly what the words are that's in the document, but that they can more explain what they're looking for, or use different words that may not be set up inside the document or set up inside synonyms as well. And so we progressed over the past year and a half in terms of building out the product more and learning more as well, to where we're at a point now where we know very well some of the strengths, some of the weaknesses of our current approach, some of the strengths, some of the weaknesses of GPT-3, and where to head from here.
So, Dustin, you talked about different models and techniques that you evaluated before GPT-3. We would be very curious to know about what were those models, techniques that you evaluated and benchmarked against GPT-3. And at what point you decided that GPT-3 is better than the other models, or the weakness of GPT-3 as you were talking about? Can you talk a little bit on that?
I think Claire's the best person to speak to this topic.
So we benchmark different technologies from just a model, optimized node, to end-to-end Q&A pipelines. We worked, BERT, I think the article on BERT was the source of everything. So we worked on BERT-like models, like from really optimized for speed, like Distill BERT, to more robust and more stable, like Roberta. And in the end, it was the use case evaluation. We did that, did the tiebreak between different models, just the quality. And yeah, just how happy we were with the quality. We put in place like a rating system, and we basically handwrote and crafted our data sets to evaluate them. Dustin, did you feel I missed anything important?
Yeah, just to elaborate on what you were saying, Claire, it's important to note for the people listening, Algolia is a search platform, right? So we're going to be probably quite a bit different than the people who are listening in on this or reading this, in that we build a technology that other companies use. And so we have more than just the concern for how does it work for us, but how does it work for our customers? And further, how does it work in terms of scaling? How does it work in terms of the financial side of it as well? And how does it work when you bring more customers on across different use cases as well? So we scoped it to specific use cases quite early on, and those specific use cases were ones that had longer textual content. So something like, for example, e-commerce was not something that we were tackling in this initial phase. It's something that we identified as a weakness as we went on, and we're working towards now. But we decided to at least focus in the initial phases, things like publishing and help desk as well, because they had that longer textual content. Additionally, we had to really be cognizant of the infrastructure side of it. So working with GPT-3 was quite interesting in that regard because we didn't have to maintain the infrastructure. For an early product, that is valuable because we can move fast. We can move fast. Claire knows a lot of things, but infrastructure maybe is not Claire's wheelhouse. She's more on the ML side. And so she could focus on the things that she was really good on. And we could say, hey, OpenAI, you handle the infrastructure. If there's a problem, we'll come to you, we'll complain to you, but we don't have to do a fire drill ourselves. It's more, we expect you to do a fire drill when things don't work.
That totally answers the question. So at what point you decided to make GPT-3 as the core of Algolia Answers? Like once you are done with evaluating different language models and had the results, and at what point you decided that Algolia Answers will be a product that will be having GPT-3 as the core?
It was really quick. So Claire came on in February. I believe we first learned of GPT-3 around late February. We started evaluating it in March. And by May, we had decided that we knew enough that GPT-3 was the direction we wanted to head. So it was really quick, but it wasn't as quick as you might imagine because quality assessment takes quite a bit of time. It is quite manual, unfortunately, especially for something like search, because we were evaluating over data sets that had tens of millions, hundreds of millions of records. And so it wasn't as simple as determining, what the precision or what the accuracy is, because it's all really qualitative. And so we did have to evaluate all of that. But nonetheless, the results of GPT-3 versus some of these BERT-based models was so different that we said, hey, this really doesn't necessitate of a deeper evaluation. Although we did keep the possibility open and we did continue to evaluate other technologies as they came to us. And we did that evaluation a few more times. Is that right, Claire? And each time GPT-3 came out on top.
So what was the evaluation criteria you were using while evaluating different models? Were you evaluating on a standard data set that you have created from some client's data or from some sort of data, and using that, like what was the standard criteria that you were using while evaluating different models?
Yeah. So Claire created a data set, and I believe it was around 100, 150 queries. And we were searching on, again, hundreds of millions of records. From there, we realized afterwards, it was a bit of a mistake. We did a 4-point rating scale. It should have been at least a 5-point scale, but we did a 4-point scale where we had to go through and manually say, hey, is this result perfect, good, okay, or bad? And so that's what we did in terms of looking at it qualitatively. If it doesn't live out qualitatively, we don't look at anything else. That's just simply the matter. Then we looked at things like speed, which we can definitely get into more because that is one of the weaknesses that we see, at least for our use case, is the speed and cost, which is definitely could be one of the weaknesses as well. And further, the extensibility or the configurability of it as well. So those are things we looked at too. The GPT-3 in terms of quality was really, really good. In terms of the other three, they were major weaknesses, which later on, much later on, made us reevaluate whether GPT-3 is the long-term solution for us. But early on, it was this manual qualitative rating process. And whenever we came across new use cases, it would be the same thing.
I want to touch upon this pricing aspect, because this is very interesting topic, I think, for everyone that is trying to build something with an API that has a pricing model like the one that OpenAI API has. It's a new situation on the market as well, that you have like model as a service sort of. And I was wondering, with so many like open source alternatives out there on the market, how did you think about it in terms of whether it makes sense price wise?
Well, there's two factors here. One is, and this is going to sound obvious, right? But it's what it costs to us and what we can charge in return, right? And so a lot of the things that I see being built on GPT-3 has just the first part, doesn't have the second part. Whereas for us, since the very beginning, the second part was quite important. And by we, Claire did a lot of work on this, and maybe she can talk a little bit about this in terms of getting that cost down. In the end, we were able to work successfully in getting that cost down and to a range where we could be profitable and have customers still be interested in what we were offering. But again, it did take a lot of work on Claire's part. Certainly, as you're being measured on the throughput, it took a lot of work in terms of getting that throughput down. And it took a lot of work. Claire did the majority of the work, but as a team, we had to discuss as well the trade-offs between quality and the cost as well, and also the speed as well, because you've got the different models. We're running on Ada. Ada, even before we knew the cost, Ada was the right model for us because of the speed, right? But even if, let's say, DaVinci was fast enough, we may have still gone down to Ada just because of the cost measures. But again, Claire did a lot of that work in reducing the number of tokens we sent over. And Claire, do you mind just talking briefly about the work you did and the evaluation that you did as well, which I thought was really interesting?
So there were different aspects to work on to improve the true output. As Dustin mentioned, to reduce the tokens, it was a question of number of documents and their length, and building some context windows, the smallest possible context windows, but still relevant enough to hold the answer and be good quality wise. Do you see anything I should mention, Dustin?
Well, I think one thing that's worthy of mentioning is I've only seen a handful of people talk about the GPT-3 capabilities in terms of searching. Most everyone is talking about the generative aspects, but in terms of searching, you see it mentioned sometimes and people are quite interested by it. But when they talk about it, they talk about searching across 10 documents that maybe have 5 words each or 10 words maximum each. That's not what we're doing. Again, we're searching across hundreds of millions of documents, and it has to be real-time queries as well. When we worked with OpenAI early on, they showed us something that they did where they searched across all hundreds of millions of documents for a given query. And I believe each of those queries took minutes, right? It took them days to get that back to us. That just wasn't possible for us. We could have potentially looked into things like caching and things like that, but at least early on, just not worthwhile. And so it's something that's, I think, is always a little surprising to me when I see people talk about the search qualities of GPT-3 and they only talk about it across 10 different documents, because that's such a toy use case. It's unlikely to be incredibly useful. And where you get into the challenge is, okay, we've got thousands even, we've got hundreds even, and we need to search at query time. We don't know what the query is going to be ahead of time. We've got a long tail of queries. and we have to get that back in, pretty quickly. It's also worthwhile noting as well that Algolia cares a lot about speed. Our traditional search, the results come back round trip less than 50 milliseconds. And so we also had to do a lot of work, not just to get the monetary cost down, but to get the latency cost down as well. Because we started out at, what were we, Claire, around 300 milliseconds, sometimes 400. Tail latency, even by, by the point where we took a step back and said, is GPT-3 the long-term solution? Tail latency was still around 300 to 400 milliseconds, which for the kind of search that we're providing, it isn't something that we can really live with. And so that was a continual ongoing struggle in terms of how do we get this latency down, but still balance quality as well. Because again, we can send 10 documents, but the quality is not going to be as good.
You brought a great point, Dustin. Like, you drew this analogy between a toy search solution and a production grade search solution, which actually makes a lot of sense, because whenever we see these GPT-3 solutions or demonstrations, we generally see people sending 10 documents, 50 documents, and 100 documents. But in production, it's never a case. A search solution generally has a lot of data. So can you talk a little bit about the architecture of Algolia Answers, and what are the technical components / models which you use along with GPT-3, and what are the optimizations you applied on top of it to reduce the latency to what you have right now? Can you walk us through that process?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of questions there, and I think they're both really good questions. But Claire, maybe do you want to start off with the general architecture of what we ended up with in terms of the reader retrieval, and then the semantic highlighting as well, I think is worthwhile mentioning, because we looked into GPT-3 for that and ultimately didn't move forward. So we can talk about that first, and then we can talk about the optimizations we did on top.
So yeah, Algolia Answers is built on a reader retriever architecture, where you have one component, which is a retriever retrieving a large set of relevant documents given a criteria, which was, in our case, textual matches, and based on Algolia's side-breaking formula. And then there was a reader which was going through this subset of documents and reading them, understanding them with the query, which was ADA, and giving us the confidence score for the semantic value that we could use then to sort our documents. This reader retriever architecture was a good first solution, but it has a lot of challenges, and especially for latency, because you have that dependency where you cannot process like the first batch and then the second batch. You have to wait for the first one, go through the second one. And since the scoring is dependent on the batch, you cannot just you cannot process all documents. You cannot process different pool of documents because it's going to change the end scoring. So this was one of the struggles we had to face with latency, and it didn't leave us many room to move many improvement in extensibility, as Dustin said. But we did manage to bring a really cool feature, which was semantic highlights, in which we had a last step, which was going through the document and the query with a Q&A trained model, extracted model, to really change the highlight from a textual match like you would have with many searches, to a semantic highlight, really to have the answer popping out of the paragraph, of the extract.
And Claire, can you talk a little bit about our process in terms of how we first explored with GPT-3 and how we ended up deciding on using an open source model for that?
Yeah, definitely. So GPT-3, the approach with GPT-3 was reusing the embedding from the prediction to compute some constraint similarity and find the span of word, which was maximizing it with the query. It was like a really good option because we had all was already computed and it was super fast. But in the end, we were more happy with the open source model quality, as it was trained to find the answer and not only find words which are related to one another for some reason. Because with constraint similarity, you're not going to get the answer. You're going to get maybe a synonym. You're going to get something which is close, but not like what we would semantically define as the answer. And this was a big power of the model we ended up with.
Yeah, and I think Claire did a really good job in describing some of the work that she and the team did in terms of getting the latency down and some of the trade-offs there. But I think something that's also worthwhile mentioning because of this reader retrieval model is there are two challenges that we kept encountering. One is on the retriever, because when you're retrieving those documents, you can't send too many documents or else the response is going to be too slow or the cost is going to be too high monetarily. And so you have to both cast the wide net, but not cast such a wide net that you're getting too many documents that aren't relevant. So that's a balance there. The challenge, of course, is that when this type of search really works, and we saw this with our benchmarking, when it really works and when it seems like magic is when it finds a document that's otherwise 150 results in. It would have been on the 15th page or 16th page. That's where it works really well. So if you're only sending, again, those 10 documents, there's not much point in re-ranking via something like GPT-3. The other challenge as well is when you then provide those results back. For some use cases, it might be good enough just to use that score that you get back from GPT-3. But in a lot of use cases, that's not all that matters, right? And so we had one use case where this was, say, news articles. And they wanted to say, okay, well, if somebody searches for presidential briefing, okay, we want things that are very related to the presidential briefing, but we don't want the briefings from Obama. We don't want it from Bush. We want it from Biden because he's the president. And it's pretty tricky to do. It's pretty tricky to do if you rely heavily on GPT-3, because GPT-3 is just coming back and saying, hey, this is the one that's most relevant to presidential briefings. So being able to pull in other business type metrics like freshness or popularity or even personalization as well, it's definitely a bit of a struggle. And so that was one of our big efforts as well. And one of the things that we're looking at right now is how do we blend all of that together? We relied early on in some heavy-handed ways, which allowed people to say, hey, when people search presidential briefing, then always have this result in the first or second position, et cetera. But in terms of blending that confidence score with some of those business metrics, it was a really, really tricky situation.
Great to know all these things. Like, it was really interesting to know how the entire Algolia Answers ecosystem works. But just a follow-up on that, like right now, as you said, it makes sense to not send all the raw data to GPT-3 in terms of cost and the speed, of course. So the filtering criteria you told that you use different kind of open source models and different techniques. So do you use some intelligent filtering criteria where you apply NLP in the previous stages with the raw data, or is it a static kind of filtering where you just filter data and instead of that wide net, you restrict it to a certain domain and then send those documents to GPT-3? Or is it some kind of intelligent filtering or re-ranking where you use other kind of NLP models to filter the data and then send the data to GPT-3?
So it's a good question. We're not bringing in other NLP models to do the filtering. I can say that much. What we're really doing is we're relying largely on the textual relevance. And again, we're casting a wide net, so it could be textual relevance in the broad sense of things, but we're not doing any ML-driven entity detection, for example, and using that to filter down. We do have some automated filtering based on some of the qualities that some of the facets that our customers provide. But that's also the thing to note as well is that we, again, are a SaaS solution. And so for that type of situation, having these ML models for entity detection is something we explored as well. And it's just really tricky because we're all about getting up and running pretty quickly. And so having these ML models on a case-by-case basis, it just doesn't work from the user flow or the customer desires as well. So it's not something that we ended up doing, even though we explored it. In the end, we decided it just wasn't worthwhile.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Like for your use case, there is always a trade-off between quality and speed. So yeah, totally makes sense. Yep.
So I was wondering, just trying to put myself in the shoes of another big scale organization that is considering GPT-3 as a potential enrichment to their product line. Of course, it's like a very complex process, starting from testing, choosing like the right type of setup, deploying, seeing how it performs in the real life circumstances. But could you share from your perspective what were like the biggest challenging moments or situations where you were trying to bring this product to life, and also how did you overcome them, if you did, of course?
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about a number of them, which we have not solved, like blending things like personalization and business metrics along with the confidence score the score that we're getting back from GPT-3, and additionally being able to bring latency down while still casting a wide net and not relying too much on textual relevance. Those are two things that are still ongoing challenges. One that we did solve was the pricing, and the pricing was, so again, we started with OpenAI before they had announced pricing, and we had gone pretty far and saw that the quality was good enough, or not good enough, but it was beyond what we could see elsewhere without knowing what the pricing was. And so it made for some sleepless nights not knowing what the pricing was, and then once we knew the pricing, figuring out how to bring that cost down, because when we first learned the pricing, we weren't sure if we were going to make it work. We weren't sure if we could make it work. And so Claire did some really amazing work on that front to be able to get that cost down. And I imagine that's going to be something that most people that interact with the GPT-3 API and want to build some sort of business on, or even some sort of project on, it has to be either profitable or not too costly. And that's going to be a big effort. And we did it because we had an intelligent team who knew the levers to pull. But even then, there were a lot of discussions about which trade-offs were worth it, and what we could do, and what would end up working in the end. So that was one of the things that we ended up solving, but definitely I see as being very universal as a challenge.
So, Dustin, you have been using GPT-3 for a long time and have been one of the early adopters of the API. So, during the course of using the API, have you ever experienced any downtime or encountered any unwanted response or unexpected response from the API? If there are such cases, it would be interesting for our audience to know about it.
Of course. We haven't in a while, though, have we, Claire? It's been a while.
No, yet no. The occasional requests, but those haven't been tested.
Yeah, it's been, I would say, months maybe. There was a period where we were seeing a little bit more, especially in the early days, which is to be expected. And there were a couple of situations where they seemed important at the time, but they're so unimportant that I can't even remember the details. But for example, and this might be worthwhile mentioning as well, is the testing that we had set up as well. Claire, can you talk a little bit about the testing and the alerting that we have set up?
So about the testing of Algolia Answers, we have quite a usual setup with a CI and end-to-end testing and uptime checks. So that's for the monitoring. We have uptime checks and global monitoring about on all the components in all the region, which we're going to alert us for when we go over a given threshold of errors or validation errors or anything. Not only 500, it's 400, it's like 421, so things like that.
Yeah, and I think worthwhile mentioning as well, and this is the part that I really wanted to call out, was part of that testing is not just uptime testing, but we are sending the same request over and over and making sure that we're getting the same response back. And so that's been a couple of situations where we all of a sudden not been getting the response back that we saw before, which is, our base. And so that allowed us to go in and say, hey, what's the difference here? Because again, for us, our customers expect some level of consistency and stability. And so that may not be an issue if you're just building something yourself and things change a little bit here and there, the scores change a little bit. But we wanted to know if there were any significant changes so that we could then share with our customers as well. Because when we're returning search results back, if you like the search results and all of a sudden the search results change, that's not so great. And so we wanted to know if anything changes so that we could mitigate against that, or that we could communicate it as well.
I am kind of looking for a word of advice from more experienced organizations to the ones that are just getting started with GPT-3. Based on your experience so far, both building, ideating, and then scaling the product that you have, what would you identify as these like good practices, or just like general word of advice on the philosophy of building stuff with GPT-3?
Claire, what do you think?
I think it's a good question. It's hard to answer. I would say early, in our case, which was something really good that changed, was getting the right tooling to help us go where we wanted, because we have such a unique use case, and we had to build our own data set on rating. Building our own rating interface was really helpful, but I'm not sure that's what you're looking for.
No, I think I don't know if that's what Sandra is looking for, but I think that's actually really interesting. Something that we learned the hard way is, so we put together a list. This was last December. Again, more sleepless nights, and so we created a spreadsheet internally as a team, which was titled "Things We Hate About Algolia Answers." And so we went in there and we created a list. And one of the things that I actually don't think was on the list, because it wasn't about the product, but it was about how we worked, was anytime I asked Claire, hey, what would this change mean for the quality? She'd go, okay, I'm going to go hole up on my computer for the next 2 days and get back to you, while I manually rate queries inside a Google Sheet. And I go, okay, how do we get this down so that you can do it in an hour? Right, even an hour isn't fun, but it's better than 10, or better than 16. So we pulled in, I always blank on the name, Claire, so you're gonna have to help me out here. Prodigy, right? And Prodigy is by
Explosion.ai. They are the one making Spaces.
Yeah. So do you want to explain, since you know the name and you know who made it? Maybe you'll be able to explain it better than I will.
Definitely. So Prodigy is a framework to help you build your rating pipeline. It's from interface to data labeling and storing the ratings, and you have all the pipelines for all NLP tasks, and even some classification in image tasks, and you can just use the pipeline using command line, and you have an interface going up, and just click or swipe. It's mobile responsive. Or you can build your customized pipeline for rating, which we did, and it was like such a game changer. Like we sped up the process by, like Dustin said, from 2 days to a couple of hours.
Yeah, I think the way we describe it is like Tinder for rating the quality of results, and so that was incredibly valuable. So I imagine that if someone is using GPT-3 and they're doing some changes to their prompt engineering, for example, and they want to see if the quality has improved or decreased, you can use that versus, again, pulling it into some sort of Google Sheets. And even using Google Sheets, Claire learned some things over time, like, hey, if there's no change, there's no need to re-rate and things like that. But Prodigy really was, as Claire mentioned, a game changer. And I imagine for anybody who is looking at this kind of thing, yeah, you definitely have to know if the edits you make or the changes you make are going to change the quality significantly. And for something like GPT that's so massive and has so many side effects, there's nothing unless you're willing to go ahead and throw it directly into production, which I don't think anyone's going to feel super comfortable not knowing what the outcome is. You do have to go in and take a look, and something that gives you some sort of tooling, so you can go, okay, this gave us 76% perfect, and now it's at 85% perfect. Let's move forward on it. Tooling like that was incredibly helpful, and I think pretty vital too.
That's awesome. Awesome tip. Thank you.
So based on a learning that you guys had so far through this entire journey of Algolia Answers, what all things you would do differently if you were to design this product again from scratch?
It's a good question. There's a lot. There's so much, and that's why we're taking a step back now and really rethinking what the architecture looks like. I think we would have thought a lot more about the latency and the confluence of different ranking factors early on, and because that was again and again the biggest pain point since the very beginning. We were always, how do we get the latency down? How do we let people influence the results? And we never figured out a satisfactory answer up until this point. And that's why it necessitated us to say, let's rethink this from the very ground up. So I think that's probably what we would have done. I think we were maybe a little too, and I hate to admit this because it's quite embarrassing, but we were a little too enamored with the technology. And I think we might come out of this going back to a BERT-based model. We might say, hey, the raw quality and power isn't the same as what we're going to get out of GPT-3. There's no denying that, absolutely no denying that. But we look at the overall architecture and we can mitigate against that. So I think we were a little too in love with the technology, and we didn't approach it enough from the customer problems, which is product 101. But sometimes when you fall in love with the technology, you can forget that kind of thing. So that's what I would definitely go back and have us do as a team is, hey, let's back up. What's the real customer problem here? And with what we know about the weaknesses of GPT-3 and the strengths of GPT-3, because again, there are very many strengths, does this solve the customer problem as much as we need? And is the market out there as well? And so I think that would be what we would do to revisit again, is say, okay, are we willing to take a hit in terms of semantic understanding because we take such an increase for everything else?
All right. So I have a final question, kind of going back a little to you as an organization. Since we have this opportunity to talk to organization like yours, which is bigger, more complex in terms of decision making, like the whole process of launching new product. I'm curious whether it was challenging to introduce such a novelty as GPT-3 in your case, or not.
Yeah. And you can see me smiling and laughing. Once you get through it, you can smile about it, but once you're in it, not so much. Getting through legal and security and procurement was maybe the hardest thing we did in this entire project, because okay, so you're sending this customer data and it's going and it's feeding this ML model, and how do we delete that data? How do we make sure it's GDPR compliant? How do we handle all of these things? How do we know that OpenAI isn't going to feed this data and take this data and feed everyone else's model with it as well, which is again one of the challenges we have in terms of multi-tenancy. And so that was definitely, and OpenAI has been a fantastic partner. The people that with whom we work at OpenAI are just really fantastic. But that was absolutely a huge challenge. If I ask Claire to implement something, she'll have it by the end of the week. But this back and forth with legal, security, with those teams, and rightfully so, they're much more conservative. There were a ton of questions that needed to be answered, a ton of agreements that needed to be signed. And that was definitely a challenge that I think if we were a team of 3 people, it wouldn't be so much of a challenge. Or if we weren't multi-tenant, it wouldn't be so much of a challenge. But being such a big organization that cares so much about security and being on the right side of the law, it's important to get these things right. And so there were a lot of questions that needed to be answered and a lot of agreements that needed to be put into place as well.
Great. Before we wrap up, just a very specific use case specific question. I mean, domain specific question for you guys. Like Algolia, as we all know, is one of the leading search solutions provider. What do you think will be the future of search, and where do you think and where does Algolia comes in? Like, do you think we are moving towards future where we will see a lot of neural search solutions or semantic search solutions going forward? And how is Algolia's take on that, like taking over the entire ecosystem?
We don't believe that anyone has truly solved blending both textual relevance and semantic relevance. It's a very difficult problem, right? Because you can have situations where things are textually relevant, but don't really answer the question. And you can have situations where things look semantically relevant, but textually relevant, just not at all as well. So we don't believe that anyone has solved that. And we believe that we will be the first. That's definitely the goal that we are working towards. But it's so much more than that, because how do you define relevance, right? How you define relevance is going to be different for every single company, every single use case. Some will want more individual personalization. Some will want more cohort-based influencing of results. Some will want just straight semantic matching. Some will want textual matching only. Some will want based on freshness or based on price or based on all of these things. So it's a really difficult problem to solve. I don't think anyone has solved it, but in terms of the future, absolutely, semantic understanding is part of it, and maybe more than that, but definitely we have staked a claim in the fact that ML and configurability are necessary, and that's a tricky thing for everyone, is to be able to understand as a non-technical user, which a lot of our customers are, to be able to go in and understand why this result is ranked number 5 instead of ranked number 1, and be able to make updates to that. Because I know as a merchandiser, I know as a non-technical user, I know my business, I know this should not be number 5. I know this should be number 1. How do I make it number 1 other than just saying, hey, you know, this is just going to be number 1. I'm going to pin it there, but giving me the control to take control of my search. That's going to be really important. And if you just throw a giant language model at it, it's impossible to troubleshoot. So you've got to give people the tooling to do that. Even if you say, okay, we just have to accept that language models can't be changed on a case-by-case basis. You need a little bit more data. You've got to give that tooling. So that's what we see as the future, is a marriage of the more traditional textual base, the more understandable and explainable side of it, with these more powerful ML models in a way that still gives the non-technical user especially control based on their user needs.
Great. So based on what I've listened to, to summarize it, the future of search will be an amalgamation of a domain understanding plus the machine learning models or AI models, and the marriage of both will give us the state-of-the-art results.
We definitely hope so. That's the goal. Yeah, the goal. And we want to continue to not just feed relevant results, but do it very fast as well. We want to. We know we're going to take a latency hit when we bring in semantic understanding. That's to be expected. But you're still going to need to be able to do the as you type searching, which further is also a challenge with something like semantic, because how do you know when someone's actually stopped typing? So that's one of the challenges that we see, and we're excited to solve it.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, guys, for sitting down with us. I feel like we've learned a lot with you today. we will definitely follow your path and how your product evolves. Thanks again for sharing with us your journey. It's been really, really interesting.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dustin. Thank you, Claire. It was very interesting, and yeah, I'm really excited to know about all these things and what's to come in the future. So all the best to you guys as well.
Great. Thanks again.